Keep this in mind. Cutting through the hype is meant to go beyond reputation, historical importance, and nostalgia, and simply judge the games as they are now. This is meant to place judgment on games that elude an honest opinion on how they've aged, so to put it simply, if someone's willing to play old games but hasn't played this one yet, would they like it? Many people will say that you should adjust your standards for old games, and while that may hold true for technical limitations, I believe that if a game hasn't aged well, it should be called out on that fact. I thought for a while what I should start with, and finally decided to give my opinion on Super Mario 64. Most people will take the time to talk about how they were probably waiting in anticipation for the N64 simply for this game when they were a kid, but I didn't play this game until actually a few years ago when it was released on Virtual Console. I was thinking of reviewing Super Mario Sunshine and Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 with this since my 5-year rule doesn't apply to a big enough series of games, but I rejected this. Sunshine is not as universally beloved as 64, and I haven't played Galaxy 2 yet, so I can't give a good comparison between it and Galaxy 1, which I've heard are way too similar in design. Since either way none of the games in different generations are too similar in design from what I've seen, each game can stand alone, which is a great feature of any series, since the biggest problem with long-running franchises is the fear of change. So I'm going to give this review as someone who's heard all about this game and gave it a shot. Anyway, first and foremost, this was Mario's first really big 3D platforming game. And I know that technically Super Mario RPG was 3D before this one, but this was the first with an emphasis on platforming and the one that most people have played before. This was the game that created the common camera system we have now, and it works pretty well in larger areas, but in the more confined regions, it can become an issue to see what you're trying to do. It doesn't help either that you can only move the camera in large rotation. This can cause problems since the camera will not seem cooperative when you are trying to make a specific jump or see what's ahead. This isn't game ruining, but it does get to be a big problem in certain maps, and it can make navigating around the map annoying as hell. This actually causes the game to become more slow-paced than you'd think, because on more than one occasion, you'll need to stop to adjust the camera more properly to see what the fuck you're doing. Controlling Mario himself, though, is a tad bit easier to pull off than the camera, though it still has some issues. Mario controls pretty smoothly most of the time, but there's a weird problem you start to notice when Mario is turning around. He turns on a wide radius sometimes, which can get you killed. I found this to be most troubling on small platforms. I also have to mention that Mario's momentum and the direction he's facing can be tough to manage when precision is required, such as during a boss battle, or when you're just trying to talk to things. When it comes to his attacks, the controls go a bit south. Mario's attack when he's running is a lunging dive tackle that might get you killed if you're in the wrong spot. But a lot of times, it's tough not to use it because the difference between using that and a punch, or a jump kick if you're in the air, is what your speed is, which can be difficult to judge. The mid-air kick can actually be helpful too, since it actually gives you extra airtime, so you can understand me getting pissed off when I needed a little extra height and accidentally dove head first into a pit. Since there are simply a lot of little things about the controls that are death hazards, the game mercifully is a bit kind if you go over the edge, since Mario's allowed to grab the wall edge if he's close enough. An issue with this, though, is that it's surprisingly easy to slip off the edge on accident, and many times it doesn't register the wall grab. Controls for Mario for the jumping are much better for the most part than the combat, which makes sense considering you'll be jumping more than you'll be fighting, but don't think that you won't have to do any of it. I'd really like the way you control the long jump and the high jump, using an otherwise useless crouch system to pull them off. There are some minor issues with this, but usually only when you're just starting to run, or when you have to make a long jump off of a small platform. Still, once you get a handle on how Mario acts in each of these scenarios, it's really easy and fun to use these to your advantage on the tougher stars. I'm not sure if it's fair to talk about the graphics, but being a debut title on the N64, there was a lot of improvement done after this. It's usually not a problem though when it comes to gameplay, since it rarely gets in the way, and that usually has to do more with the camera than anything. There do exist some issues with this though, because sometimes objects don't immediately appear until you're way too close, though these moments are rare. There's also a lot of graphical glitches in this game, but they're more funny than they are annoying, and it's actually kind of cool to discover some hidden glitch that lets you move around the map in a new way. The music is excellent. It's all around very well done and melodic. I sort of had a problem with the slower tunes, however, because they work too well in combination with the slower levels, which caused me to feel more drowsy than I actually was. I like to call this the sticker brush symphony effect. Alright, I've sidestepped this enough. Your objective in this game is to collect as many stars as possible, or as many as you need to finish the game. From the latter perspective, it's actually very well paced. Early missions give you a lot of time to get used to the controls, which is probably why the first land and the first water stages you go to are very open. With a counter of how many stars you have and a very slow difficulty curve, there's a genuine sense of progress with these missions that really helps the flow of the game. It doesn't take many stars to continue going on, so you can actually play many of the levels while avoiding a lot of the problem stars that will trouble players trying to collect as many stars as possible. The stars don't really have much of an order in terms of anything, and they're not actually that separated. It's actually possible on many levels to get the final star of the level on the first playthrough. This is mostly because not much changes about the world you're entering between mission choices in most worlds. In fact, most of the time, at least half the stars in a level are still attainable. To break this down, every level has 6 stars based on objectives, and 1 star for collecting 100 coins. There isn't much of a clue as to how you're meant to get the star excluding the title, which half the time helps, and every other time it's too vague to be of any real help. I also find it to be a problem that getting stars is more about exploration than it is about completing a challenge. Most of the challenge in these missions is simply finding the star. If you know where it is, the challenge can be getting there, and that's done pretty well and pretty often. I found though that a good majority of the levels simply give you a title and make you explore the world. This would be fine for a collecting mission, which there are in each world as red coin missions, but too many missions rely on a sense of exploration that can make this game feel slowed down at times. It doesn't help either that a lot of the times you'll find the star, and that's it! No real challenge. It might be okay for a first playthrough, but with repeated playings, the challenge becomes increasingly weak. The missions also have incremental exploration added. That is to say, one mission requires you to explore a level up to this point, and then the next will have you do the same thing but slightly different or slightly farther. It all rings of padding, which again slows down the pace. Surprisingly, this doesn't actually stop the sense of progress that much, since the stars still give you a sense that you're doing something. I've said before that the titles of the missions sometimes don't help enough to locate the stars, and I've got to say, these are the moments that will kill progress and piss you off. Going into a cannon and shooting yourself into a random corner, climbing up a mountain you've already climbed, finding a random wall that happens to have a portal with it, going underneath a level via a tiny hidden pathway. It all rings of one-time logic. That is to say, you fooled me once, but after that, it's just about going through the motions. The worlds are pretty cool. They're nicely varied and all colorful. And while a lot of them are really tough to navigate, it's still really cool to explore the levels. I just wish they wouldn't abuse this so much for the missions. Even with the lack of real objectives in many of the missions, I still found most of them to be entertaining enough because of the natural hazards. The 100 coin missions may be the exception to this, since they are very slow, especially in later missions, and can be very tedious when there are just barely enough coins to gather. My big problem with the missions and this game is the lack of any real sense of accomplishment. A lot of times the game can feel challenging and fun, but mostly it's just time passing and cheapen its challenge, because the previously mentioned control bugs had gotten me killed. Since so many of the worlds are nicely varied and have cool ideas, I never really felt bored except for some water stages and some collecting missions, but only a few missions did I ever feel accomplished when I got a star. To be honest, I got the most sense of accomplishment in setting challenges for myself, which really can be done in any game. This, however, I'm fairly certain is my issue. After all, I consider Mega Man 2 an easy game, and so my standards for difficulty are much higher than most people's. So down to brass tacks. Has Mario 64 aged well? Well, it hasn't aged horribly, and it ain't bad. My biggest problem is the lack of a fair and not cheap challenge, but that just may be me. The lower difficulty may make it more accessible for more users, and with the functional controls, nicely varied missions, and a pretty hefty length, I'd give it a try, just don't expect to be blown away. 8.0 is my personal opinion, and for players in general, it'll get an 8.5, as I expect you guys to get more of a sense of an accomplishment from this game. Certainly a decently aged game that's at least half as interesting as a game as it is as a piece of gaming history.